All right, so I think I was on discussing the Green Loop and the Lake Merritt Channel. So the special district for the Lake Merritt Channel just includes some regulations that protect the channel while allowing development, but not allowing it to encroach on the natural aspects of the channel. And then a freeway district that is intended to make the areas under the freeways safer and more active. And then the third component is the one that we're discussing tonight, and we'll get into that in more depth now. So the zoning incentive program, the intent of the zoning incentive program is to achieve density. And the original intent was to achieve that density through upzoning. Downtown is a walkable, transit-rich neighborhood. We are trying to meet the state and local goals for housing units. That includes market rate units and affordable units, which get provided either on site or through impact fees leveraged with other funds. And part of the purpose of the program is to grow Oakland's economy and tax base so that we can improve public services, fund community benefits. Those are in the downtown and citywide. And those are sort of the point of much of the point of the plan, much of the original intent of the plan. It was partially funded through a BART grant intended to take advantage of excess capacity on BART in the Oakland direction. But what we heard from the community is that the community was concerned that a lot of those benefits do benefit the city in general, but they don't necessarily reach the community members who need them the most. Low-income communities, communities of color. And so there was a desire to have an additional community benefit program that would capture. So the way that we structured it was as a voluntary program, which legally allows us to ask for those benefits from developers who voluntarily participate. And that we would achieve those additional community benefits by capturing the additional value that the development projects would achieve through increased density. So we have with us tonight Linda Hausrath, who will be talking a little bit later about the methodology behind how we developed that program and the economics of it. And just FYI, the economic report has been published on the website. It has updated the numbers that are in the planning code drafts that were released a couple of months ago. So we will be updating those draft amendments to reflect those changes, but it has not yet been updated. But we are showing tonight the latest figures from the economic report. So under the zoning incentive program, developers provide community benefits in return for increased development intensity. The benefits that they would provide on site are affordable housing. The affordability level will depend on how many of the units they're providing. Below market rate ground floor commercial space based at a 50% of market rate. Streetscape, culturally relevant neighborhood improvements. That's kind of the larger bucket. And then public restrooms in the building lobbies. In addition to the on-site benefits, or in lieu of on-site benefits, there's an optional payment of in lieu fees at a higher cost. So the city can use the in lieu fees to provide any of those benefits that are listed above, or they could also be used for job training and employment programs, which were another need that were identified through the process. But those four main ones are the on-site benefits. So the way the zoning incentive program works is that on the left, we have what we're referring to as the base map. That is the maximum height and intensity that a development project is allowed to achieve under the proposed zoning. And that's just the base zoning. So if you look at the property that the red arrow is pointing to, that property under the base zoning allows a maximum of 45 feet in height, a non-residential floor area ratio, that's like commercial, of 2.0, a density of 1 unit for every 900 square feet. This map on the right shows what would be allowed under the zoning incentive program. So that's only in limited areas, sort of core areas that we expect, where we think it makes sense to have increased density and intensity. So you can see those on the right. The other areas are gray, not filled in color. So this shows that same property. If they choose to participate in the zoning incentive program, or the ZIP, the height would be able to go up to 175 feet. The non-residential floor area ratio would go to 12.0, and the density could go to 1 unit for every 110 square feet. So to take part in the program, developers are able to earn either additional residential units or additional commercial square footage or floor area. And we are encouraging the on-site benefits by providing a 10% discount for on-site benefits over paying the in-lieu fees. A project does not need to develop all the way up to the maximum that is allowed under the ZIP. They could develop partway, and the amount of benefit that they would provide would depend on the amount of benefit that they wanted to receive. And then that same property, to figure out how much benefit they would need to provide in order to receive the amount of additional bonus, either commercial floor area or residential units that they wanted, market rate residential units, would take a look at this map. These are our benefit areas. On the left, it shows the residential benefit areas. On the right, it shows the commercial benefit areas. So this is if they want to receive residential or if they want to receive additional commercial. And these are different areas because there are different market conditions in different parts of the downtown. So it varies, the land value varies by area, the amount of rental prices vary by area. So there are different market conditions. And so we require a different amount of benefits or in lieu fees to be paid depending on the area of downtown, of the benefit area that the property is in. So I am going to turn it over to David Early, our zoning consultant with PlaceWorks, to walk us through the tables that you would be using. Once you determine where on this map the property lands, that tells you which benefit area you're in, and then you can go to the table in the planning code that corresponds. So I will turn it over to David.
Great, thank you, Joanna. Again, I'm David Early with PlaceWorks, and I've helped to write this zoning code. And before I go into all these numbers, let me first say there are a lot of numbers coming up, and I apologize. I'm going to try and make them as understandable as possible. And let me also explain that all of this work, the genesis of all of this work is the economic study that Linda Hausrath did, and Linda will talk about her methodology next after me. But I just want to make sure everyone understands that the values assigned to each of these benefits, or the costs of them, the rates at which they have to be given, the correspondence to additional units or additional square footage, and the geography of the benefit areas are all based on Linda's work that she'll be describing in a few minutes. For now, what I'm going to do is talk just about what the required amounts would be. And there are a total of 8 slides here, and all 8 slides each have a lot of numbers on them. There's a pair of slides for each of the 4 benefits. And this first slide and the first pair of slides are about the on-site below market rate ground floor commercial space. As Joanna mentioned, a developer would have the option of supplying square footage of ground floor commercial space at 50% of market rate, and that would be a benefit. Linda has calculated that the value of that, or the cost to the developer, is 290 square feet, $290 per square foot of subsidization. And what that results in for market rate units is that if you subsidize 100 square feet, as shown under allowance, then in benefit area A, you get 1.5 additional market rate units. In benefit area B, you get 2.1 units. And in benefit area C, you get 2.7 units. Some people have said they would like to see those numbers inverted. That is, to know what do you get how much do you have to provide in order to gain a certain number of units. So we're showing that here as the outcome of how much subsidized space is required to support 100 market rate units. And for 100 units, you need 6,828 square feet of subsidized space in benefit area A, 4,655 square feet in benefit area B, or 3,724 square feet in benefit area C. So these two sets of numbers are the inversions of each other. It's essentially the same, two ways of looking at the same thing. 1.5 units for each 100 square feet of market rate space is equivalent to 6,828 square feet to get 100 additional units. And that's true on every number on these charts. So that's for market rate units for the below market rate commercial space. Let's go to the next slide and I'll show you the same thing for additional square footage. Can we have that next slide? Oh, there it is. So for commercial space, if you would like to build 100 square, if you are willing to dedicate 100 square feet of below market rate commercial space, that results in area A in 1,465 square feet, in area B in 2,148 square feet, or in area C, 2,685 square feet of additional allowed office or commercial space. A question just came in the chat, why would we subsidize market rate units? We're not subsidizing market rate units, we're allowing additional market rate units in compensation for having provided these benefits. And the first of these benefits is ground floor commercial space. So the outcome for that, for the 1465, 2148, and 2685, if you would like 100,000 square feet of additional commercial space, you need to give 6,828 square feet in area A, 4,655 square feet in area B, or 3,724 square feet in area C. And again, these pairs of numbers are the inversion of each other. 1465 square feet is the inverse of 6828. So that's the first pair. I'm going to continue on now with the next slide. And this is about additional market rate units that could be allowed if you build on-site below market rate housing. This benefit applies only to additional market rate units. We are assuming that no developer would add units into an otherwise only commercial project. And so this benefit applies only to residential projects. And if you provide 1 unit of housing, you get the benefits that are shown here. So this is the number of units you need for each that you get for each affordable unit that you provide. There are 12 different unit types, 3 each in extremely low income, very low income, and moderate income. For each of those, there's a studio, a 1-bedroom, and a 2-bedroom. And you can see Linda's estimate of the cost to provide that unit, which obviously, I think it's logical. The highest cost is the largest extremely low income unit that costs over $1 million to provide. The least cost is the moderate income unit. It's a studio at $168,000, and there's a range of costs in between there. And this is the number of units that you get if you provide one of those units. So the more costly the unit, the more additional market rate units you get, with as many as 96 additional units if it's a 2-bedroom extremely low income unit built in area C where the values are lowest. And that goes all the way down to gaining only 9 additional units if you build 1 moderate income studio in area A where the units are, where the land values are the highest. So there's a whole range there, and you can see all these numbers here. And if we have the next slide, these are the outcomes. How many units in round numbers are needed to support 100 additional market rate units? And that's as low as just 1 unit or a percentage of 1 unit that you could build. If, for instance, you do build a 2-bedroom extremely low income unit, just one of those would entitle you to 100 additional market rate units. If, on the other hand, you're in area A and you build moderate income studios, you would have to build 12 of those studios in order to add 100 market rate units. And so this table shows you that whole range of numbers. And again, these two tables are the inverse of each other, the table you saw a minute ago and the next one. Let's go on to the next benefit. And that is the, next slide, please.
David, really quickly, I see a couple hands raised. Do you want to wait until the end of this section?
Yeah, there have been hands raised, and there have also been quite a number of questions in the chat. I would suggest that I at least finish this part of the presentation, and then Joanna, you could decide. I think it might be good to hear from Linda as well as to her methodology, and then we can take all the questions if you want, or we could even finish the presentation. But let's at
Okay.
least finish my part and Linda's part, because I think Linda especially will answer some of the questions I've already seen in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So we're looking for the next slide, which is the third of our benefits, which are public accessible restrooms. We have heard from a lot of folks that it would be great to have publicly accessible restrooms throughout the downtown. And so one of the benefits that we're asking developers to consider is to build a pair of restrooms that would be available during at least business hours and would be managed and cleaned by the building. Linda has calculated that both the capital cost and the ongoing operational cost of a pair of those restrooms would be about $900,000 per pair. And we've calculated that if you provide a pair of publicly accessible restrooms, in the residential areas, you would get anywhere from 45 to 83 additional units. If you wanted to build more than that number of units, you would do some other benefit. We are not thinking that we would build 3 or 4 or 5 public restrooms. They would always come by the pair. You would get 45, 67, or 83 units, depending on the area you're in. And if you wanted more units in your building, you would put do additional benefits among the ones I've been talking about tonight. So the other table here, the next table, shows that same calculation for run the other way, the inverse, if you will, if we could have the next slide. And that shows that this is not the inverse, but this is for the commercial space. If you provide a pair of public accessible restrooms in area A, you would get 45,000 additional square feet of building space. In area B, it's 67,000. In an area C, 83,000 additional square feet for that pair of restrooms that you've provided. And then the last item we have, if we can have the next slide, is streetscape open space and flood control improvements. I'm not sure that the beginning part of the presentation mentioned that public flood control improvements in areas prone to flooding and that are to the public benefit also fall into this category. This is measured in $100,000 increments. And if a developer did dedicate $100,000 investment, they would receive 5.1 additional units in area A, 7.4 units in area B, or 9.3 units in area C. That translates, if you want to think of it as what do I need to invest to get 100 additional units, it's 1.98 million in area A, 1.35 million in area B, and 1,080,000 in area C. And Naomi Schiff just asked, isn't flood control a benefit to the developer? I want to clarify that this is only for off-site flood control improvements within the neighborhood. You could argue that any of these items benefit the developer, a streetscape improvement benefits the developer, but we're talking about improvements that go beyond the property line and that are outside of what the city would require through Nexus. I think my last slide, if we could have it, looks at, we talked about the commercial space that you would get if you put 100,000 in streetscape open space or flood control improvements. In area A, that's 5,000 square feet. In area B, 7,400. In area C, 9,300. And that means that to get 100,000 square feet of commercial space, it's those same dollar investments at 1.98 million in area A, 1.35 million in area B, and 1,080,000 in area C. Last item is on my last slide that you could also pay an in lieu fee if you prefer to pay cash rather than doing any of those other things. And these are slightly higher numbers that are listed here. And the in lieu, the basis for our calculation has been a 10% discount, which you see on that top line, 19,800, 13,500, and 10,800. But if you want to pay an in lieu fee, you pay the full amount, not the 90% amount. So the in lieu fee in area A is 22,000, in area B it's 15,000, and in area C it's 12,000 per each additional market rate unit. Similarly, the in lieu fees could be paid for commercial square footage, and the numbers are actually the same according to Linda's calculation, but with 3 zeros lopped off, $22 per square foot in area A, $15 per square foot in area B, and $12 in area C. So that concludes my very detailed, boring presentation. I know I've raised a lot of questions. I've seen a lot in the chat, but I do suggest that we let Linda explain her methodology before we try and take those questions.
Yeah, I think what we might do, the idea was to go through all of the presentation of the zoning incentive program transfer of development rights and development standards. But I think maybe what we can do is have Linda finish up her presentation. We can answer questions for maybe 10 minutes about the zoning incentive program. Then we can move on to the other presentations. And then at the end of that, we'll do a Q&A that covers everything. So I will move this over to Linda. Oh, hi. Was I muted that whole time?
No,
My
we've
apologies.
heard you. We're waiting to hear from Linda at this point.
Okay, great.
Hey, I'm okay now? No.
Great.
Yeah,
There
we
we
can
are.
hear you now.
Yes, we can hear you now.
She's back on mute.
Oh, now we can't hear you.
Linda, can you unmute again? We were hearing you for a minute. Kalila, can you see if Linda is unmuted? I'm not able to see right now.
I've asked her to
How
unmute.
about that?
There we go. Now we
Yes.
can hear you.
I
Okay.
couldn't, it
Thanks,
wouldn't
Kalila.
come up. I don't know why. Oh, well. Okay, am I okay now?
Yes, we hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know, couldn't get the actual thing. Linda Houserath of Houserath Economics Group. We did economic analysis to provide input for development of the zoning incentive program. Just a minute, I'm getting something on my screen. Oh, I guess it's all right. It's in the middle of my screen. I have a note. I'll skip that. I have my own slide. Can you all see the slide okay without the box in the middle?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. That's fine. I'll keep going. There were 4 main components to the work that we did in the scope. One was to estimate the additional real estate value created by the higher intensity development proposed under the ZIP. In other words, the additional value created over and above the value of development under the base zoning. What would be the value of the additional development that the ZIP would provide? Another major component had to do with developing a framework with the city for capturing the share of additional value that could go to community benefits. The third component had to do with estimating actually the cost of community benefits desired by the city and the committees that worked on this in exchange for the higher density development. These are all things that David mentioned when he was going through his tables as well. And the last sort of major component was to be able to identify the magnitude of benefits that could be supported by the ZIP project contributions. And those were the result of a lot of that was in the tables that David just provided. That was done by comparing the value capture from additional value for community benefits to the cost of providing those benefits. Okay, the next slide gives a little more detail on methodology, particularly on the first component. Let's see, can you change the slide, Joanna? There we go. Particularly on the first component of the scope of work, this component had to do with estimating the increased real estate value from the higher density development under the ZIP. That drives the whole rest of the analysis. You know, what is the additional value we're looking at? And with the goal of identifying a share of that value that can be contributed to community benefits as desired in the plan. There were a number of steps here, and I'll just highlight them quickly. The details of all of this is in the report. We used a pro forma feasibility model for development in Oakland. The costs and revenue assumptions in here are all for Oakland projects specifically. The analysis was done using current 2021 and 2022 costs and revenues. And the data in many cases came from actual projects. Those pro formas, there were two for each combination of density and base that we analyzed. There were two pro formas. One identified the value created by development of the base zoning, and the other one to identify the value created by development at the maximum intensity zoning. So you had two runs through the pro forma. We then took a look at those two and step back a minute to assess feasibility. And at that point, we found that neither case identified a feasible project under current costs and revenues. That basically the high increases in construction costs around 2021, that those that happened, and the drops in rents that have come since the pandemic don't support feasible projects right now. And most of these that we were analyzing are very high density projects, high rise, mid rise, a lot of high rise, which are particularly costly. So at that point, we said, okay, if not now feasible, we will iterate to identify feasible projects. At what point the projects become feasible, then what would be the additional value created when real estate development becomes much more doable again. We calculated, let me just see where we are on the steps. We then calculated the difference. Once we had that normalized, we calculated the difference between the increase in value at the higher density and that at the base density. And that identified, gave us results of additional value created per additional building square foot, or per additional dwelling unit. In that way, the results could be applied to different size projects with different changes in density. So that you could apply it, if someone went to the maximum allowed and someone went a little lower to the maximum, they were allowed the same ratio. The costs and revenues were within a similar range. And so you got a per unit or per square foot increase in value that could be useful. We then considered the value capture for community benefits as being a share of that additional real estate value created that could be contributed for benefits while still retaining incentives for developers and landowners to build at the higher density. It's not reasonable to say that all that additional value would go to community benefits, in that it does not leave much incentive to developers to do this. The result of that step basically identifies 1/3 of the value capture for community benefits and 2/3 for some combination of the developers and or landowners. This is particularly relevant in a market that has no feasibility right now and is going to take time to come out. But I think in overall, they are very reasonable assumptions. We did a large number of analyses for each of the zoning combinations that were proposed. There were many. They changed over time as the plan was refined. So there was a lot of work setting all that up. It was done, I should have said in the beginning, this was all done separately for residential development and for office development, all throughout. The results were then generalized to facilitate implementation as much as possible. The maps that Joanna was showing you before with the benefit areas are a fairly simplified summary of what is required by different locations. And the differences among those areas have to do with location and rents, as Joanna mentioned, but they also are very significantly influenced by the increase in density that's being proposed there and the effects of what that does for development. In other words, there are a number of outcomes where the ZIP allows larger, taller, high-rise buildings, but both the base and the ZIP are in high-rise. There are another group, not so many, but there are some where the ZIP allows larger, taller, mid-rise buildings. In both of those cases, the economics of development of those types of buildings don't substantially change between the base and the ZIP. They just have bigger buildings, basically. There's another big group where the program would allow low-rise or mid-rise in the base going to high-rise, sometimes very tall high-rise in the ZIP. And in those cases, you're changing the economics of development. You're going to a much more expensive type 1 construction type. And so many of those, even if they might be in a fairly desirable market area, have lower contribution requirements because the economics of that additional density is different from the economics of when you're just changing the size of a building that is basically the same construction type. So that was all put together, summarized. It is described in our report. It is the basis for this. There are about 26 different combinations of residential and about similar 26 to 28 of commercial. And that is all summarized in the report as much as possible. Now, I don't know, Joanna, should we, before I start on the more housing related issues, should we take questions on the ZIP, or should I go through the next step and then we'll have questions?
Well, I'm seeing questions about the next step as well. So I think it makes sense probably to finish up those last
Okay.
two slides.
So I'll keep going. Okay, sorry. All right, next slide. Next one I want to do is address some questions that have been raised about how the ZIP program compares to the California density bonus program, the density bonus law. This is complicated. I am going to go through it in a summary level. So hopefully it makes sense. I can answer some questions if we need to have that. Both these programs are different. I'm going to just highlight here in this first slide characteristics of each. Some of you are more familiar with, I think, both of them than others. So some important characteristics of each program, which show similarities, but they also show differences, are important to understanding then what are some of the implications on the outcomes of having these two. In terms of objectives, as Joanna said, the ZIP program is really set up to encourage higher density development downtown while capturing community benefits. On-site affordable housing is one of the benefit choices. The California density bonus law, on the other hand, that program is set up to encourage on-site affordable housing by offering higher density and regulatory concessions, both of which are hoped to offset the cost of affordable housing. So one is a housing program primarily. The other has certainly affordable housing as one of the community benefits that is of interest. So they're a little bit different. They're both voluntary for development. They both offer additional density, but there are significant differences. The ZIP program, the combinations of density, all those combinations we tested go from a few cases at 11% more density up to many cases they go from low rise or mid rise to high rise, the highest of which is over 800% more density. They're very big changes. About 2/3 of the cases, just for reference, about 2/3 of the cases end up about doubling the allowable density under the ZIP, but there's quite a range there. The California density bonus program for higher density development downtown, which is very costly development. The most feasible option under that program for high rise, for on-site affordable housing and high rise, allows a 20% additional density plus regulatory concessions and waivers and things that help reduce the cost so the housing could be more affordable. In talking with developers again and working through this, those regulatory concessions end up being almost more important than density to many of them, they say. Under the state density bonus program then, to get that 20% more density and the concessions, the development needs to include 5% very low income housing units on site. Going back to the ZIP allows a lot more density in exchange for benefits, but there are a number of different benefits as David provided. So one of those benefits, however, is on-site affordable housing, and the amount that you need to provide under the ZIP goes with these benefit areas. So it can't be generalized here. I have some more direct information on the next chart. So the one allows the on-site, the other requires it. One allows a lot more density than the other. In terms of payment of affordable housing impact fees, Oakland's impact fees, that's a question that makes a difference in terms of what's provided for affordable housing in Oakland. Under the ZIP, it is assumed that the development will pay impact fees on both the base development and the additional density. So the whole new project that with the ZIP would pay development impact fees for new housing development. Under the California density bonus law, the base development pays the fees, but not the additional development. That's another incentive from them to get the affordable housing on the expensive building sites. Both programs are actually, they're different, but they're compatible with each other, and both can be used in the future. The bonus law on top of the ZIP density. Now the next slide shows, let's see, go one more, Joanna. We did some analysis to compare the differences in outcomes for housing supply and resources for affordable housing production in Oakland under one program versus the other, just to take a look at implications for affordable housing production in Oakland, potential implications as these programs go. The analysis that we did focuses on a scenario that has 26 development sites representative of the range of ZIP densities that are proposed under the plan. It is not a full scenario, a full build out of all development under the plan, but it's looking at the effect of the kind of densities you get under the ZIP compared to what you would get under the state density bonus. And again, keep in mind, they can be combined. But in this case, it's looking at the different kind of outcomes because they're different and they have different benefits, different effects for affordable housing. The conclusions of this is basically 26 projects, different from small to big, to give some idea of the mixes, what could happen when you had different mixes of development under each program. First, the higher density potential under the ZIP generates more total units of housing and more market rate housing units, substantially more, based on the maximum allowed under the ZIP. If they didn't go to the maximum, the first column of numbers there would be a little bit lower, but there's about an 80% difference between the units you could get. And more market rate primarily. The third number down there is the California Density Bonus Program provides more on-site affordable units. The numbers are not huge, but they're a larger percentage. There's 5% very low income under the 20% more density case. And there's about half that number of units for more development, which is in the range of 2 to 3%. There was one that went up to 4, depending on your benefit area. 2 to 3% of very low income under the ZIP program. So if you used all your community benefit, if you chose to do community benefit on-site, housing on-site for all your benefits, then you would be in this range. ZIP, however, generates substantially more revenue than it goes to Oakland's Housing Trust Fund for affordable housing production. It's about 130% higher in this case. And that comes from both, or primarily, impact fees that are paid on all the developments. So some of those very high increases in densities, they're paying for everything. The other one pays for less. And it also includes a share of the property tax increment monies from the new development that go to the city and to the Housing Trust Fund. The so-called, some of us call it the boomerang funds, came after redevelopment. So those monies that come from development and the ones that come from fees direct go into the Housing Trust Fund. And then the Housing Trust Fund, what the city has done is they can leverage those monies to get additional funding from other government, state, federal, variety of other sources. And recently the city reports that the additional funding has been in the range of $4 to $7 for every local dollar that is contributed. So that pot of money that can be generated by development in either case, but significantly more under the ZIP program, could be the 260 million we have there. If it were $4 more for each dollar, you're up to $1 billion. And the same thing on the 20% case, you take those dollars and do it 4 times, you're up to about $450,000. So the flow of money for affordable housing that's coming out of using the ZIP and or the state density bonus to grant densities that give you more development, basically. Getting that more development under current policy generates a lot of money for affordable housing. So the more development you get, the more money you get. These programs are different in that in one, it does require a bit more on-site affordable housing downtown. The other doesn't require any. It does give you the option by making it your community benefit. So there are significant differences in terms of the overall housing outcome. Now, as I said before, these programs are compatible and can be used together. In talking with developers and, well, let me go back one step. On-site affordable housing is very expensive in high-rise development downtown. So that is always an issue. And some developers are not going to do either program because of that. They'll choose another benefit. But those that are in this, I think they have said that in fact, the ZIP in combination with the California density bonus program could increase the incentive to use the density program, the California density program, on top of the ZIP to get the benefit of the regulatory concessions that the state provides on top of the whole building. And I think there are those who think that that is a bigger incentive to put that on higher density, basically, that you can get under the ZIP, plus the 20% or whatever you can get from the state. That may in fact increase the incentive, not only to use the state program, but combine it. You don't know to get into it, but that also makes sense in light of the fact, if you wanted on-site housing, you are looking at it in the most expensive place to put it in the city by putting it in high rise. So I need to stop there. I probably talked way too long, but that addresses, I think, some of the questions that have come up about how this would affect housing and what it could do to that existing program. So I'll stop.
Thanks, Linda. So I'm going to stop sharing screen right now. I know this is all extremely technical and complicated, though I know a lot of you are really following along and are very familiar with these issues. I think what we'll do is we'll try and respond to some of the clarifying questions in the chat. And maybe we'll take 10 minutes of those because we do want to get to the presentation of the other sections, because I know some people want to hear more about the transfer of development rights program as well and development standards. So let's start with 10 minutes, see how that goes, try and focus on clarifying questions, and then we'll also figure out, we have other ways of providing input if you have comments, but we can also figure out if it seems like we're getting close to the end of the meeting and there's still a lot, we can sort of think about options for additional questions. So David, could I ask you to call out some of the questions from the chat, and then we'll go to hands after I've asked a few of those questions that were asked earlier?
Sure. One of the simpler questions, I think, is if Linda or one of the city staff could just mention, is there a way that several people have asked to see more details of Linda's work than what's in the published report, the prototypes, the actual dollar calculations, and so forth. Is there a way over time that those can be made available to people who want to review them?
The answer is there could be, because just as an aside why I'm hesitating, I have unbelievable information. The work was done iteratively and would need to be organized, because as the plan was developed, as the staff knows, a lot of things changed. So what was first, a number of selected prototypes and a lot of assumptions changed 3 different times. So it would just take a little bit of time to get the final version into a summary appendix, perhaps, if that's what you're talking about. But yes, the information's all there.
Right,
It's
okay.
more of a timing effort question.
So we'll work on that over the next week or two and see if we can get it out to people. Couple of questions where I think I know the answer, but Joanna, I'll let you answer them. Is there any requirement about the mix of the market rate units that you get if you pay for these benefits? Do they have to be of a certain size or a certain unit configuration or anything like that?
No, there are no requirements of it. It's sort of up to the developer to select, but they would need to be providing sort of the same value regardless. So if they were providing, a more deeply subsidized unit, then they would need to provide less of those to receive the same benefit than if they were providing less deeply subsidized units.
Right, okay. Couple questions about the below market rate commercial space. One of the questioners asked if there's a requirement to let the chambers of commerce and other entities know about the availability of this space, or perhaps more broadly, how would possible tenants know that this below market rate space is available?
Yeah, I can take that. That's a program that we would be working out the details of, working with the Economic Development Department, who we've actually talked with quite a bit about this, Cultural Affairs as well, which is also an economic development, because the idea is that these below market rate commercial spaces would be targeted toward the goals of the plan. So toward mitigating the impacts of displacement on communities of color, on in this case, on businesses of color. So we would be working out a mechanism for tenanting that program according to downtown specific plan goals. So yes, there would be a process for notifying notifying all stakeholders of the
And a related question is, and I think the answer is no, but there was a question asked whether this would apply to any upper floors or if it's only for ground floor commercial space. The question was specifically, what about a first or second floor live work unit? Joanna?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have focused this on ground floor space that is accessible, but it's an interesting question since we do consider, we consider work live units to be commercial units. Yeah, Neil, did
It's
you
something
have
we
a?
might take under advisement and see if we want to expand it. Right now, the answer is it's ground floor only. Question for Linda, and Linda, I think the simple answer is there's not a single number. A question early on in the chat asked, is there a single net present value that you've assumed for a market rate unit? Could you say a little bit about how net present value of a market rate unit might play into this?
There isn't one simple thing, no. In all the pro formas that were run, there were rent assumptions as well as cost and value of development, all those things summarized, but they varied depending on the type of, we're talking about a high rise or a mid rise. Were you in, and what location within the downtown? So no, there isn't a simple one. It was specific to the type of project and its location.
Great. Okay, thank you. Joanna or Laura, there are several questions about the funding of parks and open space improvements. Would it be possible, or is it already required that they be in the immediate area of the project, and or could there be any requirement that they be only made in lower income areas within the downtown? And is this something that could be negotiated with the developer at the time it moves forward, or is it really up to the developer to just do any improvement they want and the city would have to take it?
So the thought is that the on-site improvements would be on-site or immediately adjacent. I did see one of the comments in there that was about, could these actually be applied in East Oakland or West Oakland, where we know that there's a higher infrastructure need. Maybe obviously that wouldn't be done through the on-site. Maybe there's some option for the in-lieu fees, but I think we would need to discuss that carefully and what the ramifications and legalities of that are, because it is designed to be a program to support the downtown. But again, as I mentioned in the chat, we understand that the city's equity goals suggest using funds in other locations. So it's something that we can talk about more.
Great. Okay, and I'll wrap up with two other questions about housing funds, and then maybe we'll go to some of the hands that are up, or Joanne, if you think it's time, we could go to the other topics tonight. But two questions about housing funds is there an assurance, and I think the answer is yes, that any money that Linda's talked about that's dedicated to the city's housing fund, is it for sure that it will go to the city's housing trust fund? And also, can you say more about the local match funding for or the match funding that Linda mentioned about that comes with those housing dollars?
Should I answer that, or
Yeah, you want to go ahead, Linda?
Joanna? Yes, the money goes into the housing trust fund. Whenever the fees are paid, it goes directly into the housing trust fund, and the same with the boomerang funds. Those from the city could speak more, but yes, that goes directly in, and that money, once it's in that trust fund, is used for those purposes by the city. In terms of the matching, I can't give you a lot of details right now. These figures come from city housing department information. And in fact, my partner who was in here on this, was the one who got them, but they're published figures. I could get this place where it is published. She was the one that looked into this a little more than I did, but those are actual figures from the city and their current reports.
Great, thank you.
Maybe I should just add, it's a combination of, I do know that much, of federal or state or county or special bond, a whole variety of other monies that can be matched with this. And it does change a bit over time, and the city keeps track of that. And I think the $7 was something they achieved fairly recently. Some of those monies are being used up, and I think the $4 is closer to where they feel assured, but questions of additional money to be available coming up. That's really the gist of what I think we got from them.
Thank you for those. Joanna, before I turn it back to you, I want to mention two other questions that just appeared in the chat that are basic enough that I think I should try and answer them, and I think I can just do it. One is the question is, why is this voluntary? Couldn't it be made mandatory? And I think it's important to understand that the base zoning is what the zoning exists today. And so if it became required that you do this to even get the base zoning or some lesser number, that would effectively be a down zoning, which has been discussed at great length throughout this downtown process. And although I know some people would support it, others have said that they really would disagree with that. And that's why there is this base zoning for which you do not need to engage in the program. But the voluntary part is mandatory if you want to go anywhere above that base zoning. So although it's called a voluntary program, it's voluntary insofar as a developer or landowner only can do what the zoning pre-DOSP allowed without engaging in the program. The only way to get a higher density is to engage in this program. So it's voluntary in the sense that you can keep your base zoning as it existed before the DOSP was created, but in order to get any additional density, you have to engage in this voluntary program. So I did want to clarify that. And then there was another question in the chat directed to Linda, but I think I can answer it, which is asking if the assumptions within the ZIP program were to change, would that also change Linda's results? And the answer is absolutely yes. Linda's results are based on the ZIP program as proposed. She did a lot of work to fine tune her results relative to changes that we were making to the zoning as we went. And the question says specifically, for example, if the base zoning were less, would that change the results? And the answer is yes. And at the same time, again, the base zoning is what's allowed today. And a preliminary decision has been made not to go below that base zoning because that's what existed today, and the city has not wanted to do that. So I think that's all the questions in the chat for now, Joanna. I don't know if you want to either go back to the rest of the presentation or if you would like to call on some of the people with their hands raised.
Yeah, I think maybe we should call on people with their hands raised. Maybe we can take a couple of questions. I do think we need to get to the presentation. We'll try and go quickly through the remaining presentation. It's far less complex than the zoning incentive program was, and then we can come back to this. But Alicia or Alicia, you've had your hand up.
Yes, it's Alicia. Hi, my name is Alicia Kidd. I am the new owner of Coconut Wine Shop and Bar at the Atlas that's opening at the Black Arts and Business Movement District in about 2 months. My question is to piggyback off the question in the chat. What is the, because I noticed in downtown Oakland, there's a lot of vacant spaces and I don't know why. And I was able to take advantage of the below market rates. So my question is, what are you guys doing for the existing vacant commercial spaces at these new high rises and non-high rise commercial spaces to offer below market rent, to fill those offices? Is there some kind of incentive? Because all I see downtown Oakland is just vacant spaces, but no incentivized, to fill those spaces.
Yeah, we understand, and we know that that was made worse during the pandemic as well. What the zoning amendments propose are sort of a relaxation of the requirements on the ground floor to encourage a wider range of uses on this ground floor. So it makes it more possible for other businesses to locate that might not have been located before, but that's different from the idea of subsidies. And I see that Ed Manassi has his hand up. So I will.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point, and it's something. It's certainly a program that's been featured and discussed prominently in the downtown plan, but it's not going to be implemented through zoning.
Okay.
That's what we're calling a kind of a master lease program, essentially for as a placeholder name, and it would be done in partnership with an organization to be determined. Perhaps a land trust that we partner as a city that would find interest and capabilities to kind of take on the master lease position on these vacant spaces and then do curated subleases at below market rate.
Okay. Well, I put my information, Joanna, in there because I think, again, there's existing buildings out there, and I'm part of the Chamber of Commerce, so I think we could just make that connection to advertise. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll also add that, the plan, not the zoning, calls out the city's tenant improvement and facade improvement program. So that's not a subsidy for rent, but it is a program that they are in the process of revamping, changing who's eligible for them, who's prioritized for them. And we're working with them because the plan suggests prioritizing using the same priorities as the downtown specific plan has for allocating those funds in the downtown, which is separate from how they're allocating it in the rest of the city. So that is a set of funds that the city does have available to help small businesses with their improvements. And then let me just call quickly on Michael Piatok.
Yeah.
Couple more
I've
questions.
thought a lot about this idea of the one-time payment for or in lieu fee if you don't build affordable housing as part of the market rate development. And I looked at the highest density zone that would grant for every 100 units of density increase, you'd pay $22,000 a unit towards affordable housing. And 22,000 is such a minuscule number compared to the real cost of developing affordable housing. It's about 3% of the cost of developing an affordable housing unit. So it's virtually nothing. But when you look at the difference in the rent that the developer and his investors would capture by not doing the affordable housing might be $1,000 a month, and the market rate for that same unit might be about $5,000. So that's $4,000 a month in the course of a year. That's about $50,000 more that they're getting by not doing the affordable unit. So, over the life of that unit, 50 years, that's a lot of money that the private developers and investors are gaining by not having done that affordable unit on their site. And yet we're only capturing $22,000 of that, which is 4 months rent on that market rate unit. It seems pathetically small. And when you look at that accumulated amount that you mentioned after, I think it was 250 million or something that goes into the housing trust fund. Well, that doesn't produce much housing, even with the multiplier that you said of 4, which is, about right. Over the course of the expenditure of that money, you'd get about 1,600 affordable housing units, whereas you, at the same time, you got 10,000 market rate units. That doesn't seem fair, just, or equitable, which is supposedly the motto of this downtown specific plan.
I can just respond quickly and say, I think those are very understandable concerns, and they probably do merit additional public debate. But I just want to go back and say that Linda's calculations are based not on the total wealth that would be created over time, but on the benefit, the financial benefit that does or does not accrue to the developer and the landowner at the time the project is occurring. And that is how most developers assess a project, is to look at whether the project pencils for them in today's dollars. And if you were to look at that, say, 50-year life of the project, you might come up with a different number. But I think most economists, and I can defer to Linda on this, but I think most economists would say that doing that math in that way in the end would create a disincentive for the developer to engage. So yes, you could make that decision, and yet what most economists tell us is that will end up creating, really stymieing the development if those fees being paid get so much higher.
And if you do it this way, you're not going to get the support of the public.
Let me just add something. I mean, at the moment, these projects are not feasible, so you're not going to get any development, market rate or not. When you look at what it would take to get the market rate feasible in a very, high density building, we were estimating it's probably at least a 20% rent increase from where it is now. So it's going to take quite a while to get to a place where a high-rise residential building will pencil. Then from the high-rise develop, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And the higher the requirement on them, the longer it will take to reach that feasibility point. That isn't how we calculated it, but when you look at it that way, if it's not feasible and there's additional costs coming on to the pro forma that you did without worrying about any benefits or other fees or whatever else is happening in the city, then that's going to make the space between where they are today and where you have to be to have a feasible project either take longer, you need more revenue to get to where you need to get. So we're already looking at the future. The more you add on there, the longer it will take. From the city's point of view, in terms of wanting to get density and getting more development, they've sort of opted for getting the revenue as opposed to waiting for some development to come at some point. But when you figure out what the incremental value is, which is what we did on all these cases of the additional density, and we took a third of it, even if you took 100% of it, you're not going to get to the numbers you're asking about because it is so expensive. Also, the cost, what we're doing here is not including the cost of building an additional unit in the high rise. It's the cost of taking an additional unit in the high rise and renting it at an affordable rent instead of the market rent. So the cost is the difference between their building costs so much, period. The rent is the question. And to make the building pencil, you need really high rents. At the moment, they don't pencil, but it will get to that point, hopefully. You need really high rents. So if you want to look at your building full of high rents, to say we just got to the threshold, then the more affordable rents you replace the market rates with, the higher the cost that you have to make up by having the market rates be higher. And so the numbers to put this on-site affordable housing in the most, like I said before, the most expensive building in town is really difficult to do. And that's part of what the state's density bonus program is set up to apply statewide. And it's not a put these in high-rise project, because you would have, it doesn't, most of the things they say to do that gives you more density don't work in high-rise in the center city like Oakland. So
sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to we actually only have 4 minutes left set aside in this meeting.
It's not as easy as you think, and it would delay what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we also have several more hands up. So there are clearly a lot of questions about this, and I've gotten requests to move on to the transfer of development rights program, but we are supposed to be done in less than 5 minutes. So my question would be, if you could put in the chat, would anybody be willing to stay? Like maybe would you be willing to stay for 15 more minutes or half an hour, or would you prefer we end now? Not now, in a few minutes. Could everybody just put in the chat, like, you know, if they'd be willing to stay 15 minutes, just write 15. If you'd be willing to stay 30, write 30, and we can just kind of see what people are saying. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of 30s, 15 to 30. I'd like to hear more questions and answers. Okay, let's do, you know what? We know that there are a lot more questions on this. Let's pause this for a moment so that for those people who came and wanted to hear about the transfer of development rights program, they can get a very brief presentation on that. And what maybe we can do is we can set up some follow-up. It seems like most of the questions that I'm hearing are around affordable housing and those issues as they interact with the zoning incentive program. Yeah, we'll also share how you can submit feedback to the city. I can drop that in the chat as well as people are discussing the questions. But I think we need to have some additional conversation about the affordable housing. So whether that's maybe an additional meeting or an additional email that we send out where we collect questions and then answer them. We're also working on, we've received a number of questions that were, some of which were asked tonight. And we are working on putting together some answers to a number of those questions that we are planning to get out before the community advisory group meeting next Monday. So we could always collect some more questions and add to those, or we could have a follow-up meeting. So would love to hear. So Naomi says in the chat, there should be another meeting regarding affordable housing. I think that makes sense. We're not going to get everything hashed out even if we took the next 30 minutes to do this. So I think we do need to have some follow-up on that. So I just want to go and take 10 minutes on the other topics that we said we would discuss tonight, and then we can come back to this and figure out next steps. Okay. So again, put in the chat if you have other thoughts on that meeting. Naomi says meeting. If you have other thoughts, please free to put them in the chat. But I will share my screen again so that we can go back to the presentation. And then we'll come back to questions.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Neil Gray. I'm going to talk a little bit about development standards and transfer of development rights that are proposed in the regulations. The regulations include requirements for tall buildings to have a base and tower design, although there's some important exceptions to that you can get through regular design review procedure. Create visual interest on all sides of building that people can see from the street. Breaking up the mass of buildings, and there's requirements for a quality ground floor design, as well as for a kind of terminus at the top of a building. The maximum, that's the maximum, not the minimum, but the maximum parking requirement in downtown from 1 1/4 parking spaces per unit to 1 there. And we're not proposing to change the requirement right now for parking. The maximum or the amount of parking is 0 for unit that's required. That's provided, excuse me. Talk about objective design standards a little bit. This effort is going to be followed up by a development of objective design standards that are actually citywide. And like I said, the effort's already begun. But the objective design standards for downtown are going to come first as to sort of couple with the rezoning effort. Objective design guidelines are design requirements that are measurable, verifiable, and knowable to everybody prior to the project submittal. The development of objective design standards are a response to state law and also an effort to make the process more transparent and efficient. These standards will refine the requirements that are currently proposed in the new downtown zones. And there will be a public process for development of the guidelines. There'll be a public meeting for those. So now I'm going to talk about transfer of development rights real quickly. Staff's proposing a transfer of development rights program that encourages the preservation of historic buildings. The program would allow the transfer of allowed floor area or density from a historic building that's in an historic district to non-historic sites in a zoning incentive area. We are probably going to change that to not just buildings in historic districts, but any a historic building in any areas of the downtown. We're also planning on changing the proposal to allow transfers from, like I said, from individual properties, not just ones in historic districts. Only half the development capacity allowed under the ZIP would be able to be achieved through the Trading of Development Rights program. And we're proposing this to encourage people to participate in the zoning incentive program. And that's it. So, Joanna, do you want to talk about more info, or do you want to continue the discussion of affordable housing?
Yeah. Just really quickly, since some people were asking. So to get more information, and we will share this presentation. It's already on the website for this meeting. We posted the presentation, but we'll also send a follow-up email in the next couple of days with the meeting notes from this meeting and the presentation. And we also are going to be sending out a survey. Now that we've completed this 3-meeting series, we're going to send a survey to our mailing list and encourage you to share it with any of your additional friends or colleagues or stakeholders. So you'll be able to fill out the survey if you want. You can also use our interactive version of the draft amendments, which is on a platform called Conveo. So there's a link to that as well. Or you can always just send us an email. So those are the options for feedback. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we can go back to questions. And I know, oh, it looks like James was able to get his hand up as well. So I think what we'll want to do, what we were just talking about was, yes, and the recording, we can send out the recording since we did that. Oh, sorry, I've lost the chat again. There we go. Anything else? Yeah. So I think we will probably send out some follow-up. It sounds like we're going to need to schedule a meeting to really get in depth a little bit more into the affordable housing, since that's the main source of questions tonight. But let us go for now to Jeff Levin.
Great, thanks. I'm Jeff Levin, Policy Director with East Bay Housing Organizations. I just want to make sure, given the complexities of all of this, that we're really understanding this and maybe walk through an example. So early in your presentation, you had a specific parcel you were looking at in, I believe, West Jack London. I think it was at 2nd and Clay. That's a block there, where you showed that the base zoning had density of requiring 900 square feet per unit, and under the ZIP that would go to 110 square feet per unit. That block is about 60,000 square feet. And so I tried to run some numbers, and what I came up with was under the base zoning, you could build 66 units, and under the ZIP, you could build 545 units. So an increment of 479 units, or about a 725% increase in density. That's in ZIP area R-C, and I went and looked at the table, and it appears to me that in order to earn those 479 units, you would have to provide 7 low-income 2-bedroom units. I think each of those is worth 75 market rate units. So somebody would get a 725% increase in density by providing 7 affordable units, which comes to about 10% of the base zoning. And I think it works out to about less than 2% of the total units, which seems like very little public benefit for a whole lot of developer benefit. But am I reading how this works correctly?
I'll try and answer that and say, Jeff, I didn't do anything except track your arithmetic, but tracking your arithmetic, it does sound correct. And we have not tried to translate it into those percentages that you just said, but those do sound correct also. And I think it comes back, several people, including Mike Piatak, who's gone, have said that they just don't feel like we're exacting enough. And I think that comes back to this question of Linda's calculations, which show that the costs are so high and the values created are not commensurately as high. And and as you've said in the chat, we're trying to capture 1/3 of the value created, leaving 2/3 for the developer and the landowner, 1/3 each. And with all those assumptions in place, those are the numbers we come out with. And the concern is that if we try and exact more, you could triple that. And according to Linda's calculations, there would be no financial incentive for the developer to do it. That you would be capturing the entire excess for the city with none going to the developer or landowner. You could do the math differently. Perhaps you will look at Linda's calculations and feel that they're different, or perhaps some people would say we should be charging more. It doesn't matter to us if it makes the project financially infeasible. We just need to get more housing built. That's legitimate also, but I think we need to come back to the notion that these are based on Linda's calculations that show that this is the amount that can be afforded given the patterns of development and the costs and revenues today.
And I would-
I think it
sorry,
would
if
be
I could-
very helpful then if we could actually, we talked about this earlier, if we could see the prototypes and the pro formas in the same way that we've seen for earlier studies, like when the city was first adopting the impact fee. In fact, it was Linda's work, and all of those prototypes and pro formas were included in that work, so that we can actually look and see how the rates of return to developers are calculated. And I will just note that the assumption about capturing 1/3 of the value and giving 2/3 to the developers and landowners, there's nothing scientific about that. That's just one person's opinion of what it would take to incentivize the developers. And while we might not want to try and capture 100% of the value, it's not clear that the division needs to be 2/3, 1/3. And so there's just a bunch of assumptions here that with a little more detail and some numbers, we could all interrogate and see, you know, if we're all on the same page about this.
Yeah, and I just
Yeah, and
wanted
Laura.
to add to clarify that, one of the other differences in this is that the developer is paying the impact fees as well. So normally right now, if you do the density bonus program and you provide that amount that's required by the state, then you do not pay affordable housing impact fees. So in this instance, they are getting the bonus of the additional units, but they are still paying impact fees on all of the units. So I think as per what Linda was showing is that you're also getting all these additional monies because you're getting additional density that can then go towards affordable housing impact fees. And I also want to remind people that, we are looking at, as part of the specific plan, was looking at adding density to the downtown. Again, with the fact that the downtown is the area where, people don't have to drive as much to go to work because they're near transit. We're trying to, from an environmental standpoint, helping, not only the city, but the region, as well as the fact that we do have to provide additional housing from our RENA allocation that has been provided to us by the state. So we do have to provide areas for additional density in the city, and the downtown is the area where it makes sense that we can build a lot more density. So it's a combination of things that we're trying to achieve here. And this was the value capture, which is trying to capture some of the value of the additional density, but not, again, as all of it, because again, if too much is asked, then the developer will just build the lower density, and then we don't get the added density that really should be happening in downtown if it's going to happen anywhere in the city from that perspective. So those are the things that we're trying to balance as part of this program.
So I'm seeing 4 hands up, Alan, and then Christopher, and then James, and then Tanya. So Alan. Are you ready? There seem to be 2 of you, Alan. You're muted
Sorry
right
about
now.
that, trying to get it
There we go.
together here. I think a couple of the questions.
You're muted again, Alan.
Yeah, Alan, you muted yourself inadvertently.
Alan, can you hear us? Alan?
Can a host unmute Alan?
Yeah, let me see if I can do that. I can ask him to unmute.
Okay, how about now?
There we go. Okay.
Oh, my apology.
Sorry.
Well, thank you so much. I just was listening to my good friend Linda's work, and she's very thorough. And I sometimes we don't always agree on some of the big areas, but one thing is always true: is her work is always airtight and thorough. Thank you, Linda, for that. One of the things that really kind of strikes me as being missing in the conversation, and maybe it's been taken into consideration, is doing more to harmonize some some of the other sources of affordable housing with some of these policies and practices. You know, affordable housing finance and real estate development finance and market rate are two very dissimilar metals. And, you know, one, they have different timeframes, they have different issues that don't make them very practical bedfellows. But in a situation like this, it seems that more can be done to find a way to harmonize some of those aspects so that when you afford a density bonus or where you give someone an incentive like this, there's this inclination to have a higher outcome. Right now, you know, this is, with all due respect, yes, the market is in a crazy place right now. But when the market comes back, is this still going to be appropriate and practical? And is it still going to be solving a problem, or is it going to be creating more inequality? And that inequality is just a terrible, terrible impact on our community. Then finally, the other point that I wanted to, or question I wanted to ask, was whether there's anything being put in place so that the program can morph with the changing real estate cycle, with the changing economy, so that, you know, as costs increase, as rents go up, rents come down, some of these, target things in terms of density and or affordability levels could be looked at and reconsidered. I also, one other thing in my previous point about the economics was also factoring in the use of tax increment via the EIFT and things like that, so that we can really start to make sure that we get more yield. Because I tend to be in agreement with Mike, even though I'm a developer that's experiencing craziness in terms of making projects pencil out, the yield, based on the incentive is, I don't think is politically practical myself. All right, thanks.
Thank you. And I think, a few other people have asked about changing the program over time, indexing with inflation. And I think those are all things that we can consider as we move forward, because we don't want a static program that won't work. So if you have some specific ideas on ways that we could do that, we would appreciate that.
And the thing to think about in my first
sure.
part is, for example, tax credit or tax exempt bonds and how you harmonize those types of applications in. And I think with some creativity and leveraging impact fees, things like that, you might be able to find some ways to crack that code. And I think you're going to get much more supportable outcomes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And yeah, I was just responding to your last question, but appreciate all of the comments that you made earlier on as well. Christopher?
Thank you. I had two questions for Linda, and I'll do them one by one so Linda can respond to each one. The first one, and I had both these in the chat too, but they didn't really, well, they weren't responded to. The first one is I and several other members of the working group have been looking at Emeryville's program, which is also a kind of a bonus program. And it looks pretty successful, and particularly with promoting affordable housing. And we're wondering if, and we understand that Linda did speak with the Emeryville folks or meet with them. At least that's what they told us. And we were wondering what Linda thinks of that program and whether it might, that approach that Emeryville uses might be a more successful approach, particularly for generating affordable housing in Oakland. So that was my first question. Linda, would you be able to respond to that? And are we correct that you have a discussion or meeting with the Emeryville folks? You're muted. You're muted.
Linda, I sent something that asked you to unmute.
Okay,
So you
how
should
about
receive.
that?
There we go.
Yeah, I don't think I muted before. Okay. No, I have not talked to them. We did not, our role was really not to check out other cities and what was happening with them. And I haven't talked to them. I'm not familiar with that program.
Okay, thank you for the answer. The second question is the question that David had previously presented from the chat, but it wasn't presented in full. And let me just restate the question as in the chat, where it looks like your analysis is based on the ZIP program as presented in the zoning. And the question is, would there be variations in the presented program that would produce more affordable housing and or other benefits? So for example, with changes in the base densities, especially reductions of the base densities and or bonus densities, presumably increased bonus densities, generate more benefits. And there could be variations of this depending on the area. Some of the staff people found you can't reduce the base densities because of state law. We don't believe that's true. Our understanding is that one, you can reduce base densities if you compensate with more intensity elsewhere, which is happening because upzonings are proposed elsewhere, or if the reductions of base densities would produce more affordable housing, which we think could be viable here. So were there other scenarios looked at besides just the one that staff developed and presented? That's my question.
Well, there weren't other scenarios, but there were many, many different combinations. Scenario meaning the whole area. We did look at many different combinations of base and zip densities. We never dropped below the base, no, but there's a wide range of bases as well when you look at all the combinations. Generally, the things that do better on, it's a combination of stuff. On a per square foot or per unit basis, if you're looking at going from a base to a zip density where you retain the same construction type, you do better on a per square foot or per unit basis than if you're going from a base at low rise or mid rise up to a type 1 high rise. The incremental per square foot value is lower in those situations. On the other hand, the buildings are bigger because the additional development you're getting is larger. So you can't just look at it on a per square foot basis. You have to look at the whole amount of additional density, because in some cases, those projects that go from low or low mid to real high do less well on a per square foot basis in terms of additional value, or per unit. But if you have more additional units or more additional square feet, then the total dollars you're getting are higher in the one that adds the most density. So a lot of what these things are talking about in the requirements all are on a per unit or per square foot basis. But if you apply it to something that adds a whole lot more units or a whole lot more square feet, the total dollars change, but the per unit does not necessarily. But when you go to those type 1, in many of these cases, the other thing you have to think about is on the rent side. Type 1 is affecting the construction side. On the rent side, rents are not all equal. Some of the more out of the way locations are assumed to have lower rent for that district of Oakland and that location than if you're right in the prime location. So while costs go up, rents go down a little bit for some of these far out locations. And so that's why you're seeing them not doing as well in terms of density. I don't know if that's helping or not,
Oh, yeah.
but you can look at the different combinations, but it's not necessarily, you have to look at both the per unit results as well as the total number that you're adding, basically. But back to having affordable housing in high rises, I mean, even under the state density bonus, there are cases of that happening in mid-rise buildings. There are very few cases of that happening in Oakland. The one case, or in, yeah, Oakland, let's stick with that. The one case that was done fairly recently when I discussed with that developer, it was the regulatory concessions that made the difference. And it made a little difference to not pay the impact fee for the additional density, but they were able to totally I don't know all the ins and outs of this, but you totally redesign the project. They also ended up with a mid-rise build. It was on the city block, a mid-rise building and a high-rise building. And the mid-rise building had a lot of the affordables in there. And the mid-rise building, it was a lot cheaper to build. It also had the parking. The parking was a lot cheaper to build. So if you have a giant site where you could do some combination, that makes a difference. We did not get into, is this a big enough site where you could put a mid-rise structure next to a high-rise structure and then what happens? We didn't really work with that per se, but that is a question. On the other hand, the city is really interested in density. So you're not necessarily wanting a lot more mid-rise either. When you look at some of the other big affordable projects like BART and all that, there's a higher affordability quotient, granted. But most of the affordable units are going into mid-rise, not in the high-rise tower that gets the highest rent. So when you're looking at a lot of these, putting the affordable units in the high-rise tower, which costs the most and has the highest rents, there are very, very few examples where that's happened in a feasible development without public outside money.
Okay, well,
So I'm gonna say we have 5 more minutes of the extra time that we've taken of everybody's time. So thank you everybody for sticking around for this extra bit. I know other people are needing to leave. Some people were only able to stay for 15 minutes. So we will send a follow-up email. We will schedule a follow-up so that we resolve the unanswered questions. But I do want to move on to James and then Tanya, and we will have follow-up after that. So thank you everybody for sticking around the extra half hour. So, but James.
I'll try to be very quick. I don't know if I'm understanding Linda too well or whether other people are or not, but it seems that Linda said this program, as it's been analyzed, is not economically feasible and that there won't be much building in, I don't know, in years to come that would essentially use this program. And that even if it were, well, I have a real problem with feeling that Oakland still needs more high cost and mid-cost housing, because with all the building that was done in the last 2 years, I think when those are factored into the housing needs, I can't believe that we need to build more middle-income housing. And this is not going to be middle-income housing. It seems that if we follow this program, what we're getting is a city that's balkanized. The people who will live in the downtown will be making 6- and 7-figure salaries, and the people who need affordable housing, which also can get up to 6 figures, will be living maybe on a site picked out of planned out at the Army base. I think we're on the wrong track. I really do. I think Linda has stated that the zoning of Oakland downtown zoning is already so high that people can't meet the densities that are allowed right now. I think we're on the wrong track, and I think we really need to reconsider what we're doing here. Thank you. Hi.
Thanks, James. Tanya?
Hi, good evening. I just wanted to state, my name is Tanya Love. I am the Chief of Staff of Oakland Councilmember Carol Fife, who is the council person for downtown Oakland. I did want to I'm not going to ask specific questions about the affordable housing piece. I think a lot of people have spoken to that. I do want to say that I think Councilmember Fife is probably going to be concerned about the equity. She is going to be concerned about making sure that we get, you know, basically the biggest bang for our buck in terms of in lieu fees. We want to make sure that Oakland is getting the benefit that it needs in order to meet our RENA goals. But I did want to state that the comment that I made about parking comes from a place of representing the residents of downtown Oakland. Right now, we're getting a lot of complaints that there is not enough parking for those that live in downtown Oakland. We understand that there's been just an effort to encourage, you know, public transportation, you know, less driving, all that good stuff. But there are people that are living downtown that still need parking, and they feel that they're competing against people who don't even live in Oakland, who just decide to park near BART station and take up parking space. They're competing against those who are working, who only park temporarily, and they still can't find parking for those who live there. And so I'm wondering if there's a way in this plan to consider that. And I don't know if it's possible, but there has been requests to lower the requirements for residential parking permits. Right now they have to get a certain amount of signatures, and they have to run through all these hoops in order to get residential parking permits. I'm wondering if we can have a specific plan for the residents where it makes it easier for them to get guaranteed parking. So that's something to consider. Thanks. And then also wondering if you are talking to residents in downtown Oakland, and we see a lot of community groups here represented, but we need to have conversations with residents specifically of downtown Oakland. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're happy to work with your office. We know that you are well connected to the residents, so we're happy to work with you to make sure that we are reaching them. It is exactly 8 o'clock, so we are half an hour past our time, but thank you everyone for being willing to stay the extra half an hour. We clearly have some additional questions that we need to discuss around affordable housing, so we'll be following up on a plan for further discussion of that, as well as any additional information that we can release. I'm putting in the chat just if you have additional questions in the meantime, or anything else that did not get covered, and that is not an affordable housing issue that you want to make sure gets addressed, please do email us. I also put the downtown specific plan zoning amendments website in there if you want to look, and it looks like Stephanie also dropped in the summary memo. So I know we've gotten way into the weeds, but if there's anybody here who is more interested in sort of like the big picture and seeing how the zoning amendments match the city's goals, I recommend taking a look at that. But I think we will wrap for